Welcome back. So for our second video today, we are debriefing a little bit on the Mammoth Cave biodiversity evaluation study. So this is research I'm engaged in with Professor Locke, who you met in class on Wednesday. There are a few other people involved in different aspects of it as well. We've got someone from the Department of Kinesiology and Recreation at Western Kentucky who's interested in some of the behavior about when you're choosing to go on trips like this and what you do if you get curveballs like bad weather or COVID-19 restrictions. But so the core of the study is trying to put numbers on how much people care about these different species. And that's hopefully the core contribution that's going to come out of it. And a reason to do that is right now something like the blind cave shrimp that lives in Mammoth Cave. It's assumed to have a lot of value by a lot of people because it's a species that only lives in the Mammoth Cave system. It's endemic to there. If it dies off, the populations that live there, it's extinct. That's it. And a lot of people care about that, even if it's a shrimp that you're never going to eat, you're never going to even see, at least in the wild. But it is something a lot of people care about. And in my experience, a lot of times when the rubber meets the road when it comes to policies to protect something like the blind cave shrimp, you will have people who say, we could spend an extra $4 million to put special systems and buffers in place to make sure if there's a spill along I-65 when it goes over the cave that we're not having chemicals that will wipe out this species. And you see a number, whatever that number is, as a cost of a project, and sometimes it's a big number. And that's really important, as we'll talk about. It's really important to consider the cost of different potential protections, different policies you could do. But it's also important to consider the benefits. And so, in my experience, a lot of times when you have costs that have a hard dollar figure attached to them, on the other side you have benefits protecting the probability that the species continues to exist, but there's no dollar sign attached to that. You end up basically just setting those aside and focusing on the cost and not talking all about how, well, what we really want to do is, as we'll see, some sort of cost-benefit analysis, weighing these against each other, right? So there are elements of nature is sacred, much like human life is sacred, and it's almost sacrilegious to put dollar signs on these things. There are people who firmly believe that and argue that, and they're not wrong, right? Those are arguments that are largely based on value judgments. From my personal experience, so this is anecdotal, not data-driven, very often when it comes to government policies being formulated, those sort of arguments get noted and often footnoted, and not a lot of attention is paid to them, especially if on the other side there are hard dollar figures. So even though it's not going to be perfect coming up with numbers for how much species, how much people care about species, it does give us some sense of, okay, people put real value on species that are there. The flip side, I mean, there are some species that people care a lot more about than others. And so that's where this gets a little bit controversial, because using this method, we find that people care a lot more about polar bears and Siberian tigers than they do about, you know, a mussel that lives in a river, right? Some kind of crustacean or different different critters that aren't so charismatic and cute. things that aren't going to be the subject of a bunch of nature documentaries. And so this method, you're going to end up with people willing to pay more to protect these big charismatic species. And so one of the contributions of this study, hopefully, is seeing what kind of difference you see across different species types. And so our pretest results I posted in the content section. And so take a look at those. I think they're interesting. If you look at the species that people were asked about, people were most likely to say yes to protecting the Indiana bat, which is an endangered mammal. Next up was, I believe, the flying squirrel, a cute little mammal, not endangered though. Next up were the two mussels. They were quite close to each other. I think the endangered one had a slightly higher chance of people saying yes, they'd support paying more to go to the park to protect this. So the fan shell mussel was a little over half of people said yes, pay more to protect it. The washboard mussel was about 50-50. And I thought it was interesting. The cave shrimp was actually lower. It was a majority of people said no, don't charge extra park fees to try to protect this. So I'm not sure exactly. I mean, this is a pretest with a small sample size, so it'll be interesting to see if that result holds when we have hundreds of responses to work with. If so, it's really interesting. It means people aren't putting a huge premium on the endemic nature of the cave shrimp, the fact that it only lives here. So that's potentially interesting and important to know, how much people are factoring that into their willingness to pay for conservation. I wouldn't be surprised if with bigger numbers, that result may not hold. I think that may flip, but that's a hypothesis. We'll see. I thought it was interesting. Obviously, with our pretest, we have a lot of college students, so things like age and we have a big selection issue with the sample that we've used. Environmental economics students, how likely are you to be an environmentalist or consider yourself an environmentalist? The probability is quite high, which makes sense to me. I hope that people who are interested in the environment want to take this class, and that's part of what motivates a lot of people to come here. I'm not saying you need to consider yourself an environmentalist to do well in the class, of course, right? You can be absolutely pro-development and pro-free market and pro all kinds of things and still do perfectly well in the class as long as you're learning the tools and discussing them, arguing them in good ways. College students in general tend to be a little more liberal, a little more environmentalist than the general population. And certainly if you look within, say, an environmental studies major, that would be very true. And there's a strong element of that in a class like environmental economics. You have a lot of people who are interested in this stuff, consider themselves environmentalists. I think it'll also be interesting to see how people think about the questions about protecting all the species at the park. The pretest results show a few more. People are a little more likely to favor that policy if it's coming from park officials versus a conservation foundation, a nonprofit. It's also interesting here, the vast majority of people say they would donate $5 to the conservation foundation instead of taking those $5 home with them. We'll see if that holds when people are actually looking at a real $5, right? When they are putting their money where our mouth is. In our pretest, that was just another hypothetical. So when it's real money, we'll see if that result holds as well. But so thank you guys for helping me. Your wording suggestions are great. Stuff like, this class makes sense. There are a lot of people who are from close to Mammoth Cave, so there are a lot of people who go to the park often, a lot of people doing above ground stuff there. especially recently during the pandemic, a lot of the cave tours for a long time were totally closed. Now they're open, but with limited numbers and restrictions still. But for a long time, you could go to the park and do above ground recreation. It was a great place to get away and socially distance, right? So there are a lot of people in the class who have been to the park a bunch of times, do a bunch of above ground stuff, including water sports. I'm hoping I can get decent numbers of people like you in my sample, but we'll see, because when we're interviewing people from neighboring states, they're much less likely to be making those day trips. But having people from the local population has helped point out some stuff like asking about accommodations. You need an option for, well, if you're there for a day, you don't need accommodations, right? And so thank you guys for helping me with the wording, with the typos, with figuring out when to add some response choices. If you have any other feedback, definitely let me know. And I will keep you guys informed how the research goes, right? Just like I shared these pretest results with you. Hopefully by the end of the semester, I'll have actual results from the study. We'll see. The next step is going to be submitting to IRB, the Institutional Review Board. So it's a board that looks over research projects that involve human subjects and makes sure there are no ethical concerns involved. And so you could imagine with medical research, this is really important, thinking about the risks people are getting and weighing those against the potential benefits, both to them and to the general body of knowledge. Here, it's a little bit different because there are no real risks involved in taking a computer survey, minimal risks. So it's more making sure things aren't coercive, or certainly when people are asking for confidential information, studying, topics like illicit drug use, and when you're working with minors, there's a whole bunch of ethical concerns. So it's really an important part of the research process. So that's the next step here. This project has actually been approved, but I've made changes to wording and such, so it has to go through again. Plus, the way it was approved before was for me to approach visitors at Mammoth Cave, and now it's an online format. So those changes need to go before the IRB, and as soon as those get approved, then Qualtrics, the survey administrator, is going to gather up the 200 people, and once I get the responses to that, I'll share them with you. So we'll talk more about it as the semester goes on. Thanks for being involved.